Thank you, Josh and Jess, again. Their whole life, or much of their life, they've been encouraging congregations to sing out, to sing loud. And those of you who have never listened, this is finally your chance to just not sing and be okay. No, but Jess made a very wise statement, I thought. Before we can worship outwardly, it has to start in our heart, right? So perhaps there's something to learn in the silence and in the quietness of just sitting before the Lord. So thank you guys for leading us in that time. We will, church, be looking in the Gospel of Matthew this evening. Matthew chapter 16. It's good to hear the pages turning and the movement of people. This is a blessing to be back. Matthew 16. We are focusing in on one verse, one sentence in the verse. Verse 18, where Jesus says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The title of this evening is The Promise in the Midst of Tension. The Promise in the Midst of Tension. Now, I'm going to pause right there. I meant to say this at the beginning. There's a lot of kids in here. And y'all know I don't care about that. But let's just remember, kids are a blessing. When we've had family services, y'all know. It can be a distracting, but I consider it a beautiful noise. So I just want to make sure moms, dads, don't sit there stressed the whole time. It's okay. We love having the kids in our service. So to the kids, welcome. We love you guys. We're glad you're here. The promise in the midst of tension. So when you look at Matthew 16 as a whole, right? Look at that chapter as a whole. It's a chapter really that's kind of marked with a consistent level of tension within it. All right, it opens up coming out of this scene of Jesus feeding the 4,000 and immediately comes into this moment where Jesus is kind of arguing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? And they're asking him, man, give us a sign, perform for us, Jesus. And he's like, I'm not playing your games. But he points them to Jonah. Remember, we talked about that in the series with Jonah. But there's just kind of this tension there. There's a little argument going on. And then the next scene in Luke chapter 16 is when the disciples are on the go and they just make this comment, hey, we forgot bread. And Jesus gives an answer that doesn't really apply to that, but he says, hey, a little leaven, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So you can tell, man, like there's still this tension in Jesus' mind. Like he's still thinking about some of those conversations. Still there, still present. He doesn't address their need. He just says, beware of the leaven. A little of their teaching, a little of their false teaching can lead you in the wrong way. All right, so still this kind of climate of tension. And then we move into the turning point of the whole gospel. Really in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this is the pivoting moment where Jesus is kind of announced as, the Messiah. Remember, he comes and he gets the disciples and he says, who do people say that I am? He asks two questions. Who do they say I am? Who do you say I am? He wants to know, what are the opinions of everybody? What are the thoughts of everybody? What's everybody saying out there? So they tell him. This person thinks this, they think this, they think this. And he says, okay, well, who do you say I am? And Peter steps up, remember? He says, you're the Christ. You're the Son of God. And Jesus praises Peter. And then a few verses later, he rebukes Peter really harshly. And then the chapter closes with this tension between flesh and spirit. And this call for us to deny ourselves in order to pursue the kingdom of God. And so for really the whole chapter of chapter 16 has got just this consistent tension within it. But there's this promise in the middle. It's this promise that pierces through the tension, right? A promise that pierces through the tension and brings unity and brings structure and brings truth. In the midst of a culture of differences and divisions and ultimately brokenness, there's a promise that pierces through all of those things that brings about structure, brings unity, builds a foundation for us. And it is that statement, I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Church, that means that we are the only assembled group of people in history who have the promise of God and His sustaining hand upon us. Right? No other organization or entity or institution is promised to be sustained by God. Only the church. And so our goal tonight is to see how that promise affects our present. How does that promise affect our present, Bayleaf? So as you've picked up so far, if there is a word that I could use to describe our context right now, it would be the word tense. Of course, there's many descriptive words we could use, right, to kind of throw out there to describe what's happening. But as some of the dust settles, as some of the rioting subsides, the climate of culture seems to be this place of tension. Emotions are high. Opinions are strong. Weariness is setting in for us. And I'm not just talking the big picture tensions between political parties. I'm talking, for some of us, in our own homes, there's tension. Within family members, within close friends, within church members, within co-workers, relationships, right? There's tension. And all of this tension has an ability to divide, right? When we're not rooted on the foundation and on the promise of Jesus. See, it has the ability to divide. But hear me, it does not have the authority to divide the church. Because this is the promise that Jesus made, is that there is a unity that pierces through all of these tensions, and those tensions are subject to what Christ is building. And so as the gates of hell seek to prevail against the church and sow seeds, they cannot take root because of this promise. Because of the promise that Jesus gives us as He builds His church with Himself as the cornerstone. I was reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail this week, written in 1963 to fellow pastors. And he said in his letter, he said, "I must confess that I'm not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth." Necessary for growth, right? In other words, the right tension can actually lead you forward into stronger unity, into a place of stronger relationship with the right tension. But we have to get to a place, right, where we're not just avoiding the tension, which is the natural default mode of our hearts, right, to avoid it. We can't ignore it, because if we ignore it, it resurfaces. But when we address it, we actually have a stronger unity in the end. This tension can lead us forward. Now look at the ministry of Jesus. Why would He allow for so much tension to exist all the time? Right? And not just in chapter 16, but throughout His ministry. People were always mad at Him. They're always leaving Him, right? There's always some kind of tension revolving around Jesus. Like, why didn't He just come and appease everybody? Why didn't He just come and just agree with everybody in all of their pockets? Because He came with a mission, and that was to get us to be in agreement with Him, right? That's to get us to be in fellowship with Him. He did not come to appease everyone. He came to bring everybody into Himself and build us on a foundation, and that is the church. We can be unified as the church because He has given us that avenue to do so. Notice that God did not come to bring, or this promise of Jesus is not one of uniformity, right? He's not saying to be that. He's not saying uniformity, he's saying unity, which means he didn't call us to look the same, act the same, think the same, dress the same, be the same. He called us to a unity that transcends all of those things. You see, when the world looks at the church, they ought to see the beauty in the differences, the beauty in the diversity. They ought to see that we are united not by a common interest, not because of hobbies, not because of political ideologies, but we are united in the power of the gospel. See, this is what outsiders want to see. When they look at the church, man, they ought to see power, right? Not just a bunch of people that decided they look like me and they act like me, so I'm going to meet there. No, they need to see something that transcends all of those barriers and all of the cultural and socioeconomic stigmas. The church is assembled to be an embassy that exudes the power of Christ. This is God's strategic model in how to present and take the gospel forward. It's through the church. He created it this way. He designed it this way so that we are the vessels. His strategy to reach the nations is filtered through what Jesus promises us right here, the church. Our power is not in numbers, right? Our power is in unity, a unity that finds itself in the power of the gospel, in the grace that God pours out. Jesus, when he chose his disciples, he picked a really abstract kind of group of people, right? So from the beginning movements of the church in the New Testament, it was set up, designed to be filled with people with different backgrounds, different opinions, different vantage points, right? He gets 5 or 6 of them who are fishermen. They all think alike, they all act alike, and then he throws in a tax collector who they hate because everybody hated them. And then he gets Simon the Zealot, who is that friend who just always promoting the political stuff, right? Just zealous for religious agendas and political agendas. He was that guy. And of course, there's Judas in there. Jesus knew what that would lead to. And then beyond the 12, you get into the life of Paul, right? God takes the one who murdered Christians, turns him into the greatest evangelist of all time. Ephesians 2:20 says that the members of the household of God are built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. Built on the prophets, too, which means that this is not some New Testament idea. This was in the work from the beginning. God has been assembling his people from the beginning. Right? We don't get to the New Testament and he's got a new idea. This was in the works from the beginning as he's been calling a people to himself. And now he calls it ecclesia. Right? The church. This was calculated. This was strategic. And I fear sometimes we don't see the church like that. Perhaps we see it as a place to gather with our friends. Perhaps we find the church that meets our preferences. But long ago, before the beginning of time, God was calling a group of people to himself that would unite themselves, not in just common interests, but in the power of the gospel. And as he continues to assemble his people, he gives us a mission to go, right? And to continue building the church, as he says to Peter in 1 Peter, or as Peter says to us, we're like living stones being built up. We have to hold on to that promise right now. That Jesus is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. We are not sustained by our resources or our numbers or our location. We are sustained because of this promise. Jesus said, I'm building my church. and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now, that doesn't mean that the enemy won't come knocking. And sometimes he comes with a battering ram, right? Sometimes he comes with a little lock pick, and it's a little more subtle. So the attacks will come, but the promise that we hold to is not that we will always agree on everything. It's that Jesus is building his church, and that is something the enemy cannot tear down. That's where our power is. It's in his promise. I started with the word tension, and I'll end with the word dialogue. Dialogue. There's a reason the Bible is 66 books and not 66 characters in a tweet. Because the story matters, right? The narrative matters. Words matter. Clarity matters. Jesus is the ultimate form of dialogue, isn't he? As he became man, God in the flesh, he didn't just show up one day, throw out blanket statements and leave. He came and he dwelt among us. He lived with us. He grew up. He became acclimated to culture. He engaged politics. He engaged brokenness. He dwelt among us. And so that's where we have to arrive, I think, church, as we look at this promise and we see that Jesus has promised to build his church with himself as the cornerstone. We stand in that promise unified so that we can go and address the tensions that we sometimes fear because they might divide us. No, those tensions do not have authority to divide God's church. We can't let those seeds take root. God has a promise that's bigger than those things, bigger than our agenda, bigger than our opinions. And he says, when you cling to this promise and you live your life as a member of the household of God, nothing comes against it. So, perhaps we need to have the hard conversations, have the awkward conversations. This was a heavy week with all kinds of things, and I could list numerous things that add to the weight that people sense right now. My African-American friend called me this week, and he said, "Hey, man, I just calling to check on you." I said, "Dang, man, I need to call you, check on you. Forgive me." I said, "Man, are you tired?" He said, "Yep." And then he said, "But I'm never going to stop having the hard conversations." He said, "That's what leads people to a place of healing." And that's what really started to bring me to tears. And I'm like, questioning myself, do I avoid the hard conversations? And then he said that he seeks to position himself so that he can engage the hard conversations, so that he can dialogue. Sometimes in our context, Christianity becomes a bumper sticker religion, right? We throw it out there and then we hide behind it. And there's no room for the most important piece in the communication process, dialogue. And I'm guilty, right? I had some unintended frustration from some of you because of what I posted on the internet concerning George Floyd. Meant no harm, meant no division. But it's because I'm proving my point. There's no dialogue. There's no room for dialogue when we become a people who just throw statements out. The church is called to go into the community, to have the dialogue, to have the conversations, and to enter into the brokenness, to listen, to weep, to understand, and to offer hope. Because we do not have to fear that the church is going anywhere. This will stand because of this promise in Matthew 16. Galatians 3:13 calls us to bear one another's burdens. 2 chapters after this, in Matthew 18, we're instructed to go to the person who's offended us. Right? Have the hard conversation. Dialogue. Romans 12:16 tells us to live in harmony. There's 88 keys on that piano that Jess beautifully played. Every one of them's different. Every one of them makes a different noise, a different sound. But when you play it, especially when you play it like Jess, it's beautiful. There's harmony because it's all working together. God has designed the church like that piano. It's all different. But when we come together, united in our purpose, what we were created to do, it is a beautiful picture of unity and power in the gospel. And so our differences become something that actually promote God, that actually enhance people's perspective of God. And we get to cling to his promise that nothing can come against that. So I encourage you, go back, read Matthew 16. Meditate on that promise. Ask yourself, where's the tension in my own heart, right? Ask yourself, has dialogue been a part of my process? Am I dialoguing with the right people? Am I entering into some of the harder places? All right, church, let's pray.